My name is Kamyar Hassanzadeh. I'm a university lecturer actually in geoinformatics in University of Helsinki nowadays in Department of Geosciences and Geography. But here you see I have also included the Aalto University and University of Turku's logos because the work that I'm going to present today is actually based on the work I have done in these two universities. So I have a background in geoinformatics from Aalto University, and I did my PhD in Department of Built Environment at Aalto University. And after that, I continued as a postdoc in Aalto University and then University of Turku, and also for a while in Singapore, uh, University of Technology and Design. So what I'm going to talk about today is about the work I've done during my PhD and later in part of my postdoc. So I will be talking about participatory mapping or PPGIS, and particularly focusing on what are the applications and uses of PPGIS uh, for urban research. So there will be a lot of material in this presentation, and the idea is to give you some overview of PPGIS, what it is, how do we collect this kind of data, what are some of the uses and applications of this data for urban research. And then at the end, I will talk briefly about data protection and anonymization of this data if someone is interested in publishing their data openly. So I will start with my presentation now, and at the end we will have time for questions and answers. So hopefully we'll have some comments, some questions at the end that we can go through. Yeah, so before I get started, I would like to acknowledge other people who have been working with me during my research. So the work I've done in Aalto University was led by Professor Marketta Kyttä at Department of Built Environment. Also, I've worked closely with other people, Tiina Rinne and Anna Kajosari and other people in the team. So, and in the University of Turku, I've worked closely with Nora Fagerholm and other people in the team. So all the work I'm mainly focusing on the work I've done myself, but some of the work I mentioned here, I go through here, is also work done by other people in you see here. So they should also get the credit for the work. So today I will start by talking about PPGIS. If you're not sure what it's short for, I will go through that quickly. So you will learn what PPGIS is about. Then we will see some examples of our research. So hopefully you will get some idea how we can use PPGIS to answer some of the research questions that are topical in urban studies. Then we will have a quick look at 3D PPGIS. This is the work I was doing in the University of Turku, and we will discuss whether this is a potential future for PPGIS. Is that the direction that research will take eventually? And at the end, we will talk about open participatory mapping data. So some of the work we have done for anonymization and publishing PPGIS data. So as urban dwellers, we all have different ideas of our cities. So we see our cities differently, we experience our cities differently, and we also have different ideals. So if you ask someone, what do you think of your city or how do you want it to change, you probably will get different answers from different people. So some people, sometimes this preferences can be also contradicting. So for example, people's ideas of cities, how cities can be better, how the living environments can be improved, can be significantly different. Someone might like to live in a more peaceful area where you have access to a lot of green natural areas. Someone might want to have a bit more urban, may want the environment to be a bit more urban, higher densification, and so on. A person might be interested in biking, so they may want their neighborhood to be more bicycle friendly. On the other hand, there are people who prefer to drive around with cars, so they may want to have more parking spaces around their home. So those are some of the examples of different preferences people have when it comes to their living environments and what the criteria is for making a living environment better. But if there is one thing we all agree upon, despite all the differences we have in views, is better living environments. So we all want to have better living environments. Of course, we have different definitions of better living environment, what makes a living environment good. But one thing we agree on is that we want our living environments to be better. And this is something that has brought many researchers from very different disciplines together to work on different urban topics. So it is fair to say that urban studies, urban research is one of the most multidisciplinary areas of research in science. And this could be one of the reasons why, because we have a common goal and and cities are complex. So there are a lot of things that we can study. So we need a wide range of professionals coming from different backgrounds to study sometimes very different or very similar things, just from different perspectives. So in urban studies, we often have researchers, professionals coming from very different backgrounds, such as transportation engineering, social sciences, geoinformatics, urban planning, public health, geography, and so on. And under this main theme of having better living environments, they work on topics such as environmental health promotion research, active living, environmental child friendliness, and many other topics. There is a famous saying that no science achieves maturity without data, and that is, of course, valid for our field of research as well. So we have a lot of questions, for example, like what I said, what makes our living environments better? And in order to answer this question properly, we need to have access to data. Nowadays, luckily, we have access to many different kinds of data that can help us answer different questions in different ways. I personally come from a quantitative background, so I'm more interested in the kind of data sets that allow me to perform different kinds of quantitative analysis to find answers for my questions, but also there are a lot of examples of qualitative data that can be collected and used to study different things. But as I said, because of my background, what I will be talking mostly about today is more on the quantitative side. One of the examples of the relatively newly emerging data sets is public participation GIS data, or PPGIS, that we are going to talk about. And this is a kind of data set that allows us to conduct person-based research on different topics related to cities. So where is the starting point of PPGIS, or these participatory approaches in planning and also in research? So the idea comes from the fact that we are making cities for people. So if we want to make living environments better, and by living environment, I mean space, the space and everything that is included in the space. So when we talk about the urban structure, all the facilities we might have, the transportation system, and so on, all these are made for people to make their life better and help them do whatever they want to do in their everyday life. So it makes all the sense. If you're doing something for the people, the knowledge coming from the people should be also included in our decision making. So the decision making should be informed at least by the knowledge that comes from the people. So this is the starting point for use of these participatory approaches in planning, and particularly research, that we will be mostly talking about today. So traditionally, there have been several ways of getting access to this public knowledge for planning purposes, particularly. So planners, cities, different authorities have been, in many countries, have been interested in knowing about people's preferences regarding their everyday living environments. So traditionally, this kind of knowledge and information has been collected through public hearings, interviews, different kinds of surveys, and observations of different kind. So there are pros and cons for each of these approaches, but there are a few limitations with some of these. One limitation is that, well, for example, with these public hearings, there's always a concern about the representativeness of the people who show up at this kind of public hearings. Usually, these hearings are biased toward more negative feelings, negative opinions, because people who show up very often have very strong negative opinion about things, and people who are happy with things are usually underrepresented, and that's a problem if you're collecting some kind of data, so it may not be so representative, a very good representation of the population we are studying. And also previous reports and efforts have shown that people who show up at these hearings may not represent the whole society, like different socio-demographic groups, and that's another problem. Another problem, which is particularly problematic for me as a quantitative researcher, is that this kind of data is very hard to work with. So if you have hearings, you might take notes, you might record people's opinions in different ways, or if you have a paper-based interview, you have very valuable information coming from the people. But using this kind of information is difficult, especially if you want to do anything quantitative with the data. So these are some of the limitations that exist with these kind of approaches for collecting, for gathering knowledge from people. So this is where the idea of PPGIS started, at least in our research group many years ago. So we were thinking that, okay, we want to know about human behavior and experiences. That's what we want to study. We want to see how people use the urban environments. How do people experience the environment around their homes or the places they're exposed to on a daily basis? And based on these experiences, we wanted to answer a number of research questions. But in order to do some kind of quantitative analysis, if we want to do GIS analysis, we need to link these behaviors, these experiences to the physical environment. So what we have referred to, so on one hand, we have this soft GIS knowledge layer. That's what we used to call our approach back in the days. So we have this soft GIS knowledge layer. On the other hand, we have all these layers of data, these more traditional hard GIS knowledge layers coming from different sources. So we have different layers of data about different things in the cities, in the urban environments. So the idea of PPGIS is that we would find a way to link these two layers, so we can create maps, we can do different kinds of analysis and do different kinds of quantitative work. So this kind of approach enables us, as I said, this is a new approach to participatory planning. So instead of having those public hearings or interviews or all those other traditional ways of helping people participate in planning processes, this is a new digital way. And on the other hand, this can be a source of very valuable data, place-based and person-based data that can enable us to perform different kinds of transactional place-based research. And the idea here is that, well, we have the planning and then we have research at the same time, and this kind of complement each other. And this is something that you will hopefully see during my presentation with the examples I present. But yes, so the idea is that PPGIS knowledge can be valuable both for doing research and also a way for implementing participatory planning. So you might be already wondering what I mean by PPGIS and what does it mean in practice. So in my opinion, one of the beauties of PPGIS is that the idea is very intuitive and simple. So what PPGIS is, well, there are different versions of PPGIS, but now we are talking about digital PPGIS, which we use in our research group. So it's basically a questionnaire. So we are all familiar with these traditional questionnaires. They can be on paper or digital. So the idea is that you are asked a number of questions, and the questions can be about different things in different formats, depending on what it is that we are studying in that particular project. And then we have a mapping component. So this is what makes PPGIS different from a traditional questionnaire. So we have a traditional questionnaire part, and then we have a mapping component. So people are asked, well, people see a map, and then they're asked to map different things, to place different kind of markings on the map and answer a number of questions about different markings they place. So the questions we ask, the type of markings we have depend on the project and what kind of data, what kind of information we need to answer our research questions. But very often in the traditional questionnaire side of the survey, we ask people about their background, their socio-demographic background, and we usually have some theme-specific survey questions. And in the mapping part, we often ask people to map, for example, their home locations, their workplaces. In many cases, we want to study people's mobility or accessibility to different places. So we might ask about origins, destinations, and different kinds of important places. Usually the markings are points because it's easier for people to mark points on a map, but it doesn't have to be limited to points. Sometimes they have also asked people to mark lines, for example, draw a route from point A to point B, or how they go from home to their workplace and so on. So it can be a polygon, an area. So it's usually points, but it doesn't have to be. So for those of you who have some experience with GIS or working with data in general, you might be wondering what the data eventually looks like. So I have a screenshot from ArcGIS here. You can see that eventually the data you export from the system it's a simple GIS data. For example, in this case, you can see it's a vector data set with points. And for each of the points, we have some attributes. So it's a combination of the spatial information. So we have coordinates, at the same time we have attributes. So if a person has marked a place, they have usually answered a number of questions about that place, whether they like the place or dislike it, or how they feel about it, or how they want the place to be developed in future. So this extra information will appear as extra attributes or columns in the data. So the data is very simple in format and easy to analyze and visualize. So we have used, over these years, we have used PPGIS, this public participation GIS approach, for different kinds of research and participatory planning practices. So different themes have been studied with PPGIS: environmental health promotion research, active living. Recently, we have been studying the changes to people's use of public spaces and green areas before and after pandemic. So different topical issues can be studied using this kind of data. We have worked with various user groups. We have collected data from children, adults, elderly. From the planning side, it can be used in different planning phases and even in different scales and for very different purposes. So let's have a quick look at the history of PPGIS in our research group. So the idea was started back in 90s. Obviously, I wasn't working in that research group back then, but the idea started there. So we were looking for some kind of methodology for studying person-environment relationships, some kind of participatory urban planning approach. So the idea started there, and then already in early 2000s, we had a prototype of the survey tool, which was called SoftGIS back then. And by end of 2000s, it already developed and became better technically by the team in Aalto University. And in recent years, it turned into a spin-off from Aalto University. So it was commercialized by some of the colleagues who used to work here. And now it's a tool called Maptioner, which works quite well compared to where we started from. And not only it allows you to collect the data, but also through the platform, you can even perform some simple analysis. So some of the examples of participatory planning project, it has been used for studying parks and recreation in different cities. It has been used to study building designs, projects related to environmental planning, transportation, urban planning and development, and so on. So the approach has been used in many different places. Here you can just see a few examples from cities around Finland and around the world. And it has been used even at different scales, sometimes a very large area, sometimes it was used in a master's thesis from Otaniemi campus for studying indoor spaces in the main building. So applications are very wide. If you're interested in learning more about PPGIS surveys, and if you're more interested in the planning side and learning about how they work, what are the pros and cons, I invite you to read this paper by Marketta Kyttä and others, where they review 203 real-life public participation projects using PPGIS in Finland and different countries. So they have a very good review of how this works and what are some of the observations. But for you listening to me, I have a summary of some of the findings. What are the strengths? What are the limitations of PPGIS as a participatory approach? So some of the pros of this kind of data collection method, well, we can look at the pros and cons in 3 lights. The first lens is extensive participation. So when we do this kind of participatory approaches, one of our main aims is to have an extensive participation. And with PPGIS, we are quite successful with that. Of course, this is all relative, but relatively we have been able to collect data from large groups of people. So as I said, in some of the traditional methods, it's hard to involve people, at least a large number of people. In PPGIS data collection, we very often have data from, like data collections we have done in Helsinki area, we often have over 1,000 participants. And the data set we get is quite large. So that's a good thing about PPGIS. We have been able to reach new resident groups. So some of the people who do not show up in those public hearings or interviews, they might be more comfortable participating through this platform and online from the comfort of their home. And we have been able to foster individual participation. But of course, there are limitations. Participating online through these methods might be appealing to many people, but at the same time, some people may not like it. Digital divide is a fact. Some people are not comfortable with using this kind of technology for participation in different topics. And there can be problems with data manipulation and technology stress and information overflow and such. The second lens through which we can evaluate PPGI is the quality of the data. So of course we can collect data through different approaches, but one important factor in making the data usable is the quality of data. So how good is the quality of PPGI's data? Well, the data is relatively good. It allows us we have been able to collect localized knowledge related to planning in different situations at different scales. As I said, the limitation with many of those traditional data collection participatory approaches is that the data is overly negative. In PPGIs, it's a bit more balanced. So you also collect a lot of data that also tells good things about cities, which is important because you want to know the good examples, you want to know what is working well so you can do similarly in other areas. So that's an improvement. And another good thing about PPGIS data is that, well, it's in digital format, so it can be easily integrated into existing systems. So at least I know in some cities in Finland, for example, city of Lahti, in the city's GIS, the Geographic Information System, they have already one layer that has information coming from PPGIS. So they have this regular PPGIS data collections, and it is integrated into their geographic information system as a layer of data. There are also limitations in terms of the quality of data. There is a possibility, this is not necessarily limited to PPGIS, but there's a possibility that data can be misused. Researchers, planners might be just cherry picking to prove some of their existing presumptions. So they don't look at they may not look always at the whole data. there can be a potential lack of transparency, and people might get frustrated if they don't see any changes. So if you collect these data sets from people, but they don't see any tangible difference in their living areas, then eventually they might get a bit frustrated in this kind of with this kind of participation. Another lens through which we can evaluate PPGIS is the effectiveness, the influence of participation. Some of the pros, it is easy to implement. So compared to many of those traditional approaches I mentioned, it's easier to implement. You design the survey online, then it's rather easy to recruit people. We have used different methods. For example, very often we have collected samples from the statistical offices, from the registry, and then we have approached them via mail. Sometimes we have advertised the surveys online on different social media or different channels, website of the cities, and so on. So it's rather easy to implement this kind of data collection. It can be done in different geographical scales. In terms of planning, it can be useful in various phases of planning. Yeah, so there is also the chance there are some cons, some limitations with this as well. It can lead easily to top-down continuation of top-down participation. It can take the form of non-meaningful participation. And very often the digital methods alone are not sufficient. So if you use this, there might be need to use other methods of data collection as well together with this. So it should be complemented sometimes with other methods. So this was a bit about PPGIS, how it is collected, what are the pros and cons of using PPGIS for planning and research. But from here on, I'm going to go through some of the examples of some of the empirical work we have done using PPGIS data. And this is the area that I have mostly worked in because of my background. I've done mostly empirical research. So I will go through some of the work I have done. I don't cover the details, obviously, because there isn't enough time to go through everything. But the idea here is to give you some overall overview of what can be done with PPGIS. And if you are interested in learning more, of course, you can refer to the papers I introduce here, or you can get in touch with me later and we can talk more about some of this research. So one of the good things about PPGIS knowledge is that we have information, we have different, you collect data within one survey, but you collect multiple layers of information. So it's different kind of information coming often from one survey. So one of the core layers of information we have in our surveys are the place-based knowledge. So we have, depending on what it is we are studying, what is the project, what kind of data we have collected, we will have place-based knowledge about different things. So sometimes it's about planning, about future development. So we ask people to mark things on a map and say how they want that place to change or be developed. Sometimes it's about people's living experiences, like in what areas. We ask them where they feel safe or unsafe, or where they feel more comfortable, or I don't know, in what areas, what green areas they value most. So it's about their present or past experiences with the cities. So this is an important part of the PPGIS data we collect, but at the same time, we have other information. So we have knowledge about individual preferences very often that we use in our analysis. So when we are doing the analysis, it's important for us to know what kind of people we are studying. For example, if we are doing some statistical analysis after doing some GIS, we may want to take these factors into account to know what kind of people it is that we are studying. So depending on the project, we ask about people's lifestyles, their attitudes toward different things, and personal preferences. Very often we ask individuals about their background information, their age, gender, education, income. Again, very often we use this in our statistical analysis simply because we want to know what kind of people we are studying so that we can take that into account when we are making some kind of conclusion. And very often we have some kind of outcome variable. So we ask people how healthy they perceive themselves. If you're studying something related to health promoting urban environments, or we ask about perceived happiness or how active people are. So these are some of the outcomes that we measure directly through the survey. So how do we analyze PPGIS data? So we have been working with PPGIS data for a long time, but a few years ago, a group of us from Finland, several universities in Finland and even abroad, we sat together and tried to conceptualize the way we approach PPGIS data analytically. And for doing that, we use this pyramid of knowledge, or DIKW pyramid, which is well known and used in different computational sciences. So the idea is that in this pyramid, you start from data at the very bottom of this pyramid, and with each step you take up the pyramid, you answer some of the questions you had, some of your research questions, and this adds to the value of the initial data. So the deeper you dig in the data, the more you analyze, you gain a deeper insight into your data or what you're studying. So in the first layer, you do some basic analysis, you contextualize your data a bit, and you gain some information from your data. If you dig a bit deeper, if you do more analysis, you gain knowledge from the data, and more often, less often, you might do very advanced analysis. And if the data is really good, then you might gain wisdom from the data, meaning that you understand that topic, that phenomenon very comprehensively. So we simplified this pyramid into these three phases of analysis, which we call explore, explain, and predict. So you do some simple analysis, you explore your data, you often find some pattern, you see some kind of pattern in your data, and with doing some analysis, you can explains the potential reasons for these patterns you see in your data. And if you do good enough analysis, you might be able to predict things for areas where you don't have data from, or for future. So that's how we have simplified our approach to PPGIS data analysis. This is another way of visualizing these three phases of analysis. So in the explore phase, well, as I said, in PPGIS, we have the non-spatial attributes. We have spatial attributes. We usually look at them like separately. We might make charts. We might make some kind of maps. Very often, we don't add so much context, just maybe a base map in the GIS. In the explain phase, you start to look at the non-spatial attributes in relation to the space, in relation to the spatial PPGIS data you have. And also, very often, the base map you have is not enough. You start to include different layers of GIS data into your analysis. And in the predict level, the idea is the same. It's just you dig deeper, you have more layers of data involved, and you try to reach a more comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon that you are studying. So most of my research personally has been focusing on exploring person-environment relationships. So some of the themes that I have worked with are mobility, so looking at urban structure and seeing how it affects or how it is associated with mobility patterns of individual. I have, during my PhD, I have looked at the topic of activity spaces and trying to see how people's behavior and health, perceived health, is associated with the characteristics of their activity spaces. We have also looked at travel patterns in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. We have looked at children's independent mobility in several studies. In many of our studies, we have looked closely at residential environments, for example, seeing how the built environment can affect people's travel behavior choices. We have looked at health, active living, for example, how people's exposure to different kinds of areas can affect their perceived health and well-being. We have looked at environmental perception, how people perceive and experience different kinds of urban structure. So as I said, a big part of my PhD was about environmental health promotion research. So when we talk about the association between the urban structure and people's perceived health or perceived mental or physical health, we are looking usually at two things. One aspect of this is the environment. How does it help shape your behaviors, your habits? So imagine you're living in an area where you have a lot of shared bicycles, you have a lot of bicycle lanes through which you can easily travel around, you have a lot of nice, well-maintained green areas. So this might help you be a bit more active, change your lifestyle, and in turn you will become maybe healthier, or you will perceive yourself healthier. Another side of this is the more direct effect of environment on people's health. For example, if you're exposed to green areas, you might benefit from the restorative effects of this kind of areas. There is a lot of research on this. Or if you're exposed to highly polluted areas, if you're living next to a very crowded highway, the air pollution might have direct effects on you mentally and physically. So when we talk about environmental health promotion research, it's important to distinguish these two uh, these two this is two sides of the coin, these two aspects of environmental health promotion research. So how we usually do this research is by asking the right kind of questions. Uh, so the questions are usually like, okay, how can the geographical context affect a person in a certain way? So you might be looking at green spaces or walkability or urban density. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. Usually the question is that, okay, this is my urban context, this is my geographical context, and I want to see how that affects people. So this might seem simple and straightforward, but when you start to do GIS analysis or any kind of analysis, then you have to be very clear with your words. So if you say geographical context, what is a geographical context? So what should I be looking at? Where should I do my analysis so that is best representative of the person's most relevant geographical context? So that's the question I was trying to answer during my doctoral studies. So we wanted to do this person and place-based research. We knew from our dataset where the person lives, we knew their everyday places, but we didn't know that, okay, if I want to see how green spaces affect the person's life, what should I look at? So very often at the beginning, we were using these circular buffers around person's home. Usually it was 500-meter in radius, but it wasn't good because we know that, okay, this choice of distance is very arbitrary. The fact that many researchers use it doesn't necessarily make it better. And then we knew that from people's markings, we knew that they go to many places which are beyond this 500-meter. We can also tell that from our personal life. A 500-meter radius around our home usually doesn't capture all the areas that are relevant to us. So we wanted to come up with a more individually sensitive way of defining neighborhoods. So that's the question I was trying to find an answer for. So that led to my dissertation working on the spatial units of analysis. So exploring different ways of modeling people's the most relevant spatial units of analysis for people. So one concept that I worked on was activity spaces. Activity space is a set of geographically distributed locations that individuals physically contact with. So to make it very simple, it's the area that contains your activities during a day. So trying to create a model that can capture that in the most feasible, best possible way, and then trying to incorporate that into our analysis, trying to also work with the problem of modifiable aerial unit problem. People who have done statistics or studied GIS, worked with GIS, they might know what this is. This is a problem when it comes to analysis. So the choice of spatial unit of analysis can cause problems with that. There's also the problem of uncertain geographic context problem. So if you're looking at the relationship between a person's different aspects of life and, for example, how green their neighborhood is, depending on what unit you use, do you use that buffer or some kind of shape, some other kind of unit of analysis, uh, it can affect your findings, and your findings can be biased. So that's another question I was trying to answer in my research. So this is the path I took during my research. As I said, before I joined the team, we were using these static buffers around people's homes. In the first step, we developed this parametric, more systematically defined convex hull representing individualized home ranges. So based on where the person lives and what are the places they frequently visit, we created this kind of buffer, and not buffer, this kind of convex hull around the activity space. We did different kinds of studies using this kind of unit for our analysis, and our results showed that this was a great improvement already compared to the statistical buffer, the static buffers. But there were still limitations with this approach. When you are using a polygon for your analysis, you are making a few inaccurate assumptions. One of them is that uh, uh, you're assuming that all areas are equally accessible, all areas are equally important. That's why in the next step, we represented the activity spaces using an estimation of people's exposure. We did different kinds of analysis to see how they perform. And we concluded that there is not a single approach that would suit all situations. So the answer is more like what you're trying to study, and then based on what you're trying to study, your kind of analysis, you should choose your special unit of analysis. We developed several tools for different kinds of modeling, and they are published. So if you're interested in using them, you can check this paper out. It comes with a GitHub repository where you can access the code and use it in GIS. We also, in our work, demonstrate how we can use these approaches in the empirical research. We also developed an index called polycentricity index, which is a simple clustering analysis showing whether the person's activities are all clustered around the person's home, or they're bicentric or polycentric. So I'm not going through all the studies we have done, just showing you some screenshots from the papers we have recently published about different themes. So if you're interested, we can discuss it more, or you can read the papers. So we have done different work about mobility and travel behavior. Also a couple of articles from after pandemic, looking at how people use spaces differently after the pandemic. We have looked at health and active living in different places. We had one study conducted in Auckland, New Zealand. We have different studies about residential environment and preferences in Finland, and in Tampere and Espoo and Helsinki and different cities around Finland. And quickly about some of our ongoing work, we have recently collected the PPGIS data from Espoo. The data is quite big. This gives you some idea how effective PPGIS can be for data collection. So we had around 6,600 participants, and altogether they made 70,000 markings. So that's a very large data set to work with. You see a screenshot of the data here. So it's a very nice data set to do different kinds of analysis with. One of the things we worked on was actually the idea of this came from City of Espoo. They wanted alternative ways of mapping neighborhoods. So not just using these administrative boundaries, but based on people's actual use of the spaces. So we use this concept of activity spaces that we had used earlier for our research and redefined some of the neighborhoods in Espoo. This is a study that is under review right now, but hopefully it will be published soon. We also use these models to identify the centers in Espoo, not the administrative centers, but rather based on the actual use of the spaces by people living in different areas of the city. We also have another study currently under review in which we study the the quality of green areas as perceived by people, and we also create a predictive model. So the data is not from old ESPO, but using what we learned, we could create a we could use a probability-based model to create a prediction. As I said, prediction is the third phase of analysis, which is more difficult, and there's very few research working on this. So a bit, I don't have so much time, so I go quickly through 3D PPGIS, the topic that I was working on during my postdoc in University of Turku. So the idea is that, well, the world is changing, there are new technological possibilities, and as culturally, we are developing an increasing visual culture. We are so used to using different devices, phones, smartphones, computers, and we are so used to good visualization. So eventually, for PPGIS to remain relevant, it has to take some technological steps. So one of the ideas we recently explored is the use of 3D visualization in collecting PPGIS data. Green Place project. So this was an academy-funded project, and we explored how PPGIS can be done using 3D visualization. So it was a collaboration between University of Turku, Maptioner, the spin-off company from Aalto University, and a company that helped us with the 3D work. So the data was collected from it was a small study, some pilot study from one city block called Aninkainen in Turku. So we collected data from a small sample of 135 people, and we explored their feedback. So most people said that it is rather easy to work with this depending on the device you use. So on phone, it was a bit complicated, but on computer, it was easier. But most people said that use of 3D approaches, 3D visualizations, would be helpful for this kind of participation. So what I was working on during this project was to develop ways of analyzing this kind of 3D PPGIS data. So we use this framework of dividing the analytical methods into macro level and micro level analysis. So macro level meaning that you study the whole city or a large region in general, or micro level looking at a small block in the city or some smaller area. For doing this, we also generated synthetic PPGIS data because our data was only from one city block. In order to study the macro level area, we had to have data, and for that methodological purpose, we created synthetic data. I won't go through the details of how it was worked, but we have published a paper based on this. So if you need synthetic PPGIS data for your methodological work, you can check this paper out and create synthetic data for your work. And the result was different kinds of metrics that we developed for analysis of 3D PPGIS data. Another area of work that I've recently explored in my work is open data and science. We know that it's good. Open science is good. It has practical reasons. It's recommended by many funders, by journals, and so on. And there are also ethical reasons why we want to be transparent and practice open science. So we wanted to publish some of our data sets. And we knew that in order to do that without violating GDPR, we have to anonymize our data sets properly. So we have to make sure that individuals cannot be singled out. No one can link the data with other data and guess what is the or try to identify individuals, or use any kind of machine learning or other modeling methods to try to identify individuals. At the same time, we wanted a method that is simple and efficient, meaning that we can redo this for different projects and we can publish our data sets. And we wanted the method to be context-based, so we developed an approach for doing that. I won't go through the details of that, but the study has been published with all the details, and you can check that out. We performed different kinds of tests to see how it affects the anonymization affects the quality of the data. And the conclusion was that the data, of course, loses some of its quality, but it is usable for different purposes. So the data is now published, some of our data sets on Zenodo. So if you want to get some experience working with PPGIS data and the things I've been talking about today, you can check that, download some of the data. We have a paper published based on how we anonymize the data. And I have developed as a hobby some WebGIS tool to anonymize your data. Now it's under maintenance, so I didn't put the link here, but I can share that with you later. So a few conclusions before I finish. PPGIS is a powerful participatory tool, sorry for the typo, participatory tool for data collection and research, for participation and also research. It has its pros and cons, as we reviewed during this presentation. There is a need for methodological developments, like we have been working on 3D. There is also a limitation with PPGIS, and that's including any kind of temporality. So the fourth dimension has been more or less missing from PPGIS. That can be an area for future research. Our research showed that open participatory mapping data is possible. You just need to take considerations into account to make sure that you follow the legal guidelines and rules. And what you can take from this presentation, you can use our data. Some of them are published online. If you're interested in creating some synthetic data, you can refer to the article I shared with you. And there are some of the tools we have often published our tools openly, so you can find our tools and use them for your research. Yeah, thank you very much. And one more thing, if you want to, we have a community, participatorymmapping.org, with a few partners from several universities in Finland and abroad. So if you're interested, you can check that website out. We also have a newsletter. So if you join, you get regularly some updates about some of the publications and the projects we do. Yeah, so I'll be here if there are questions.